The first frost of 1841 came early to the Blue Ridge. It swept down the hollers like a curse, seeping through the gaps in every poorly built cabin, from the high ridgelines to the river bottoms. Animals grew quiet. Smoke curled low and slow above chimneys, hugging the valley floor. In one of those folds of land near the edge of what we now call North Carolina, a man named Ephraim Cade was already splitting wood by lantern light before dawn. His knuckles bled from cold cracks, and his breath came out thick as fog. Inside his one-room cabin, his wife Louisa huddled with their infant son beneath two quilts. The fire burned low because they couldn't spare much wood. Every log they burned was another day closer to running out. The draft coming through the west wall made the candle flicker, even with the shutters closed, and it wasn't even winter yet. But what Ephraim did that season, what he figured out in that tiny cabin when desperation gave him no choice, would ripple through the mountain communities for decades. Not because he was trying to invent anything, not because he considered himself smart, but because something broke in him that autumn, something that wouldn't let him accept another winter the way the last one had gone. The warmth of a home, the airtightness of four walls, the difference between surviving and slowly wearing down, that wasn't a luxury out here. It was the line between life and death. And Ephraim Cade had already buried too much to take chances. The year before, the cold had taken his daughter. They didn't talk about it, not really. Folks around those parts knew the price of mountain winters. You just bore it, like a scar you didn't show but always felt. Little Sarah had gotten a cough in January, and despite the fire being fed through the night, and Louisa boiling pine needle tea until her fingers blistered, the cough turned wet, then ragged, and by the time Ephraim rode 3 hours to the preacher's house to beg for medicine, it was already too late. Sarah had died on a Tuesday. She was 5, and the day they buried her, a crust of snow still clung to the inside of the cabin walls. That winter had cracked something in Ephraim's soul. When spring finally came, he'd torn down half the cabin wall and started again, fueled by a kind of quiet fury. He didn't have blueprints or education. What he had was anger, grief, and the hard-earned knowledge that doing things the way others did them wasn't good enough. The chinking he'd used before, the mud stuffed between logs with a stick, maybe a little moss here and there, had crumbled under the wind. Every trapper, every settler used the same technique, handed down from whoever showed them how to stack logs. But the mountains weren't kind to mistakes, and Ephraim was done making them. He tried different mixtures: red clay pulled from the bank of the creek, sand from the shoals, ashes from the fireplace, crushed leaves. Some held better than others, but none sealed out the cold completely. That's when he remembered something an old Cherokee woman had once told his grandfather. "The earth will hold if you mix it like it grows." At the time, the phrase hadn't made sense, but now, staring at the moss growing thick on the shaded side of the hill, Ephraim had a thought. Maybe the answer wasn't just dirt and water. Maybe it needed to breathe, just a little. Maybe it needed to live. He spent that summer testing, not just tinkering like some curious man in a workshop, but working as if his family's life depended on it. Because it did. He tore out his old chinking entirely and began again. First, he layered a mixture of wet clay and ashes into the deepest gaps, packing it with a gloved fist. Then came the moss, dried first in the sun, then shredded and woven with twine into flat pads. These he pressed into the gaps like insulation. Over that he smeared a second layer of clay, thinner this time, mixed with sand, and a strange addition, ground egg shells. He'd heard from a traveling peddler that the lime in shells helped harden earth. He had nothing to lose by trying. When the first heavy storm hit in September, Ephraim's cabin was the only one on the ridge that didn't leak. When the wind came out of the northwest and peeled shingles off other men's roofs, Ephraim's held fast. But still, he wasn't satisfied. He'd seen how water, even a thin drip, could freeze in a wall and blow out a gap like a musket shot. So he returned to the woods, not for timber this time, but for roots. Long, fibrous roots from scrub pine and rhododendron, stripped and soaked, then laid into the mud like sinew. He mixed them directly into his mud and moss blend, making it strong enough to stretch without cracking. It wasn't pretty, but it held. What happened that winter was what turned Ephraim's method from a personal obsession into a whispered legend up and down the hollers. The freeze came hard in December, nights below zero, ice so thick on the creek it took an axe to reach water. Families bundled together in corners of their homes, teeth chattering, children crying through the night. Chimneys smoked black into the sky from fires that never went out, and still most cabins bled warmth like sieves. People boiled water just to keep it from freezing. Pans of broth turned to slush 2 feet from the hearth. But not in the Cade cabin. In Ephraim's house, the fire burned low and steady, the walls warm to the touch. No frost on the inside, no drafts through the corners. For the first time in their lives, They could breathe without seeing it. And when neighbors came by to trade or ask for help, they lingered a little too long in the doorway, their eyes flicking across the seams of the log walls like they were seeing a secret someone forgot to tell them. The questions came soon after. "What did you put in your chinking, Cade? How come your place ain't icing over? Is that moss? You put moss in your walls?" Ephraim didn't boast. He didn't need to. But when he spoke, folks listened, because out there in the cold, results spoke louder than pride. He showed a few men what he'd done. Some mocked it, called it foolish. One said it looked like a squirrel nest exploded between his logs. But others tried it, quietly, piece by piece. One wall, then two. By spring, 5 cabins had adopted some version of the Cade mix. By the following winter it had a name. Mountain mortar. That was what people called it, though Ephraim never used the phrase himself. He wasn't trying to start a movement. He was trying to keep his family alive. But what he'd built, what he'd figured out through trial and grief and fury, would become a quiet revolution in Highland cabin construction. Over the next decade, versions of his mix spread from ridge to ridge. Each builder added their own touch. Some used animal hair, others added wood ash or powdered bone. But the core remained. Layered insulation, natural fibers, clay hardened with mineral additives, and a builder who knew what was at stake. What no one knew, not at first, was how close Ephraim had come to giving up before that final winter. There was a letter, never sent, that Louisa found years later, tucked inside a hollow of the hearthstone. A letter to his brother, written the week after Sarah died. In it, Ephraim wrote of failure, of not being able to keep his daughter warm, of thoughts so dark he couldn't speak them aloud. He'd considered leaving the mountains, heading back east, selling what little they had left. But he stayed. He stayed because the grief had nowhere to go, and because leaving meant surrendering to a cold that had already taken too much. What he built instead wasn't just a new wall or a stronger chinking recipe. It was a defiance written in clay and moss, a refusal to let the mountain win. And what came next, what spread out from his cabin like heat from a well-fed hearth, would touch lives far beyond the narrow hollow where it began. By the time word of Ephraim Cade's method reached the next valley over, the snowpack had already locked the ridgelines and trails into frozen silence. Men who hadn't spoken to their neighbors in months found themselves trudging over icy hills just to peer at his walls. They squatted down beside the seams, picking at the clay with their bare hands, sniffing the fibers like bloodhounds, running fingers over what looked to them like nonsense, moss, roots, dirt, and ground-up eggshells. Some laughed, called it witchcraft. Others took notes. A few tried to memorize the feel of it under their fingers. And then something strange began to happen. The men who mocked him started asking questions with quiet mouths, not in front of others, not over drinks or during Sunday gatherings, but alone, one by one. A knock at Ephraim's door, hat in hand, voice low. "You mind showing me how you did it?" Ephraim didn't turn anyone away. He wasn't a prideful man, but he wasn't in the habit of handing over the whole recipe either. Not because he wanted to hoard it, but because he knew most men wouldn't respect the process. They'd skip steps, they'd cut corners, and they'd wonder why their walls didn't hold, so he made them work for it. He invited them to help as he built an addition to his own cabin that spring, a small room meant for Louisa's aging aunt, who'd be moving in before winter. Ephraim knew the valley well enough to understand that adoption of a new technique didn't come through sermons. It came through sweat. So he gave them shovels, made them dig the clay pit, made them strip moss from shaded hillsides, dry it on wood racks, crush eggshells in mortars until their palms blistered. It wasn't punishment, it was education, and it weeded out the ones who wanted results without labor. 2 men lasted the whole project, Aaron Hensley and Eli Boone, both younger than Ephraim by a decade, both recently married, both with cabins already showing the first signs of rot and frost splitting. Aaron was the one with questions, always asking, testing, trying to understand why. Eli was the quiet one, watching every motion like it might save his life. It wasn't long before they began refining the process. Aaron suggested soaking the moss in salt water before drying, thinking it might help deter insects. Eli carved a wide-headed paddle out of oak for packing the clay layers in tight between logs. The tool worked better than fists. Ephraim started using it himself. By midsummer, they had what Ephraim called the second batch. This wasn't just dirt and moss anymore. This was a calculated system with steps. First, clay sifted and kneaded with wood ash to break it fine. Then the dried moss, pre-treated in salt brine, shredded and pressed into mats, crushed eggshells added for hardening, fibrous roots woven in, then the oak paddle, tapping each layer into place with steady rhythm. Over time, The motion became meditative, almost sacred. Not just cabin work, ritual. Ephraim didn't care about names or titles, but Aaron started calling it Cade's skin, like the cabin was being wrapped in a second hide. The phrase stuck in town lore long after Ephraim's death. But before the legend formed, there came a test far harsher than any winter storm. That fall, the Cade family received word that a fever had broken out in the valley to the west. Typhoid, they said, or something like it, carried on unwashed hands and bad water. Nobody was sure. By September, 3 families were gone. Some fled, others died. A few boarded themselves in and tried to wait it out. Fear rode the wind heavier than the first frost. People stopped traveling, stopped talking, no one touched. And yet word still found its way. Louisa's brother Nathan lived in that infected valley. He'd lost his wife to the fever and was now sick himself. Ephraim faced a decision man should have to make: stay isolated and safe, or ride west into the heart of the sickness to bring his brother home. He didn't hesitate. He left at first light with his mule, a jug of vinegar, and a bedroll coated in pine tar. He returned 3 days later with Nathan, half conscious and burning with fever. Louisa wept when she saw him. She'd already started sewing black ribbons for mourning. Nathan was too weak to speak. They laid him on a cot near the fire and kept the windows closed, the room dim. For 5 nights, he raved in his fever, clawing at the air, muttering names no one recognized. But here is where the story takes its strange turn. Nathan recovered, not fast, not easy, but he lived, and no one else got sick. Some said it was luck. Others whispered about the clay. They said the mix somehow sealed more than just wind. They claimed the moss filtered air, that the lime in the eggshells cleansed the space. No one had science to explain it, but more than one old-timer swore that Cade's walls were more than weatherproof. They were sickness-proof. Of course, that wasn't true in any real sense, but belief spreads faster than facts in the mountains, and belief, when given shape, becomes tradition. By the following spring, there were 13 new cabins with double-layered moss chinking. One family even tried using cattail fluff as a filler. It failed, but the spirit of experimentation was catching. The mountain was full of men who'd lost children to cold and wives to illness. The chance to build better wasn't just practical, it was redemptive. The preacher, old Josiah Tollett, gave a sermon that May titled "A House Built on Clay." He meant it spiritual, of course, but every man in that room thought of Cade's cabin, standing firm on the ridge, its seams tight as bark, warm even in the dead of January. And when the congregation filed out, more than a few paused to ask Ephraim about the mud recipe. He said nothing during the service, but when asked directly, he always answered. He never charged, he never held back, but he always made them mix their own. No one got a ready-made solution, not because he wanted to be cruel, but because he understood. The only mix that lasts is the one you make with your own hands. That summer, Ephraim and Aaron worked on what they called the Big One. It was a community hall, nothing fancy, just a longhouse-style cabin near the river bend that could host gatherings, weddings, and, if need be, serve as refuge during the hard months. The town had talked about it for years but never built it. Too much labor, not enough hands. But this time, the reason was stronger than convenience. Everyone had seen what happened when illness swept through homes. A single shared warm building, sealed tight with an interior hearth and fresh chinking, might serve as a sick room, or a nursery, or simply a place to survive together. Construction took the entire summer. 20 men worked on it. Ephraim guided the process, but he didn't lead with words. He showed by doing: how to strip bark with a draw knife, how to test clay with a thumbprint, how to lay moss like a stitch in cloth. The men joked less as the work wore on. Something about the way Ephraim worked made them quiet. Not sad exactly, but reverent, like they were building more than walls. When the hall was done, it was unlike any structure most had seen in those hills. Tall rafters, thick, curved logs, 2 hearths, one at each end, and a stone bench that ran the length of the interior wall to absorb and radiate heat. But it was the walls that people talked about. Smooth, dark seams between the logs, packed so tight that even in high summer, the air inside stayed cool and still. Women said it smelled like earth after rain. Children said it was the first cabin they'd been in where you couldn't hear the wind. And then the floods came. In September, 3 days of rain turned the river into a roaring brown beast. It swallowed fences, pulled wagons from roads, and chewed away at the edges of every building within reach. Most of the low-lying cabins took water. Logs shifted, chinking cracked, fires went out, and the cold rolled in behind the storm like a second wave. But the halls stood firm. Men waded through waist-high water with lanterns, carrying their children on shoulders, cradling babies wrapped in quilts. They brought food, blankets, and rifles. By nightfall, over 30 people had gathered inside the big cabin. The fire roared, the stone benches radiated heat, and the seams, Cade's seams, held out the wind and wet. People remembered that. They remembered it long after the storm passed, long after Ephraim was gone. They remembered what it meant to feel warm while the world drowned outside. And they remembered what it cost to learn how. By the winter of 1843, they weren't calling it superstition anymore. The ridge people had always been slow to change. Generations had stacked logs the same way their fathers had. If a cabin smoked bad, they'd widen the chimney. If the chinking crumbled, they'd stuff it back with creek mud and straw and pray the frost didn't knock it out again. The old ways worked well enough until they didn't, until a wind snuck in just wrong and took a baby's breath in the night, until a sickness took hold because the damp never left the bedding, until you stood outside your own cabin, looking in at the body of someone you loved and wondering if warmer walls would have made the difference. That was the quiet shift. It wasn't that people stopped believing in hardiness or stopped trusting the old ways. It was that Ephraim Cade had offered something more than a technique. He'd shown that you didn't have to accept suffering just because it was common. His mix, what folks had come to call mountain mortar, or Cade skin, or simply the fix, wasn't magic, but it worked, and that, in those mountains, was as good as gospel. Still, not everyone took to it. There were holdouts, always would be. Rufus Jarnigan, an elder of the Pine Bend community, had built 3 cabins in his life, raised 10 children, buried 4, and he saw no reason to start smearing moss and eggshells like some moss witch. He called it vanity, claimed it was just for show. My daddy's walls had cracks you could spit through, and he lived to 89. But the truth was, Rufus had seen what Ephraim's method had done to the frost line in the Cade cabin, how the ice stopped short of the logs, how candles didn't flicker in the corners. He'd never admit it aloud, but one night when no one was around, he came to borrow a shovel of clay and asked Louisa, without meeting her eye, what ratio of moss to sand Ephraim had used. He didn't use it right, not at first, mixed it too wet. But he was trying. Pride would be the last thing to thaw. That winter was brutal. A series of nor'easters slammed the southern Appalachians in January, bringing days of snow and wind that cracked trees in half and stripped roofs like they were made of parchment. Whole valleys were buried under feet of snow. Wagons froze in place. A man could die 10 steps from his own door. But through all that cold, Ephraim's longhouse stayed lit. It wasn't just that it was warm, it was quiet, the kind of silence only proper insulation can provide. No drafts, no rattling shutters, no smoke sucked sideways through a chimney throat, just the pop of coals and the low murmur of survivors. A woman named Adeline Merrow gave birth in that longhouse during the second blizzard. Her own cabin had collapsed under snow weight, her husband killed in the fall. She was 9 months along, carried in on a sled by 2 boys barely old enough to shave. They laid her by the stone hearth, wrapped in every blanket they could find, and it was Louisa Cade who helped deliver the child, a daughter, healthy and pink, who never once gasped from cold. They named her Mercy, and the tale of her birth became part of the growing legend. But legends are fragile things, and in March, a fire nearly shattered it all. No one knows how it started. Some blamed a tipped lantern. Others said it was an ember kicked loose by the children who slept too close to the hearth. Whatever the cause, the blaze caught in the southeast corner of the longhouse. Fire loves dry wood, and for all its insulation, Cade's mix could not make timber fireproof. It climbed fast, licking up the wall, racing toward the rafters. Ephraim wasn't there. He was up on the ridge cutting logs for Aaron Hensley's barn. But Eli Boone was, and so was Louisa. They moved fast. Louisa threw wet quilts against the flames, screaming for buckets. Eli used an iron fire poker to knock the burning thatch from the window eaves. Children were passed out through side doors. Smoke filled the space, thick and low, stinging eyes driving people back. But the strangest thing happened. The fire stopped, not snuffed entirely, but slowed, staggered. The layer of clay and moss in the wall, thicker than standard chinking packed with damp fibers, didn't catch. Where the fire hit solid timber, it roared, but where it touched Cade's mix, it hesitated, sputtered, blackened, and failed to leap. The fire had met something that fought back. That gave them time to douse it, to beat it down, to cut out the scorched boards, and toss them outside into the snow. The longhouse didn't fall. It stood, smoked, blackened on one side, but still standing. And that was when the skeptics gave up. By the thaw, men from counties away were coming to the Cade Ridge to learn the method. Some wrote it down, others sketched diagrams. Ephraim never once charged coin. He showed them how to find the right clay, how to identify moss that dried flat instead of curling, how to grind eggshells with a stone bowl and pestle. He taught them to cut saplings for root fiber, to test the mix with a dry stick, and to feel the right texture with a single palm pass. A group of German immigrants who'd settled down valley adapted the mix into a stone house construction. They layered the moss-clay composite between stone blocks and reported similar benefits. One of them, a man named Klaus Brenner, wrote to his brother in Pennsylvania describing the method. That letter became a curiosity in building circles back east. Within 2 years, a version of Cade's mix appeared in a homesteader's manual printed in Charleston. The recipe was off, missing the salt brine step, using straw instead of moss, but the credit was there in small print. Method originated in Cade Hollow, western North Carolina. That mention was the first time the wider world heard Ephraim's name. He never read the manual. He'd never seen a printing press. What Ephraim did care about was replication. He wanted others to do it right. He taught more men, not just locals now, but masons, tanners, even a preacher from Tennessee who wanted to retrofit his clapboard church with inner walls made of Cade's mud mix. Ephraim advised him to build a second structure instead. The technique worked best with log seams. But all this, every visitor, every cabin redone, came with a weight. Ephraim began to feel it around his shoulders like a yoke. Not regret, not pride, just pressure. Like he'd been handed something that could help people, and now it was his to bear alone. That's when he made the decision to document the process in full. He didn't write well. His spelling was poor, and his grammar worse. But he could shape sentences the way he shaped logs, slow, deliberate, functional. He filled 3 notebooks with his observations, each page a tight scrawl of step-by-step instructions, notes on weather patterns, mixtures that failed, and cabin dimensions that worked best for heat retention. He included drawings, crude but clear, of how to layer the moss, how to angle the chinking tool for best compression, how to build a scaffold against taller walls. He wrote it not for himself, but for anyone who might pick it up after he was gone. When Aaron Hensley found the notebooks years later, he said reading them felt like hearing Ephraim's voice from the grave, clear, calm, and never wasting a word. But before that grave came, Ephraim would face one final trial. Not a storm, not a fire, a betrayal. In the summer of 1844, a trader named Clarence Milton came through the Cade Hollow with a wagon full of tinware and cheap whiskey. He heard about the mix, saw the longhouse, spoke to the men who'd built with it, and then he made Ephraim an offer, $500 for the rights to the recipe. He wanted to patent it, publish it, mass-produce kits of pre-measured materials. "We'll call it Cade Compound," he said. "You'll be famous, rich." Ephraim refused, not angrily, not dramatically, just flat. "It's not for sale," he said. Milton didn't take it well. He came back 2 weeks later with a notary and a forged paper claiming the mix was his own. Tried to sue Ephraim in a Charleston court for intellectual theft. The suit failed. No judge could enforce ownership of dirt and moss, but the insult remained. Ephraim didn't talk about it, but those close to him said he stopped smiling for a long time after that. Still, he kept teaching, because in the end, that's what mattered. Not the name, not the credit, but the warmth that kept children breathing in January. The walls that didn't sweat sickness into the bed sheets. The cabins that stood when the rivers rose. That was the legacy, and it was only beginning. By the spring of 1845, Ephraim Cade's name was spoken with a kind of reverence in the Highlands, not as a prophet or hero, but as something quieter, the man who figured it out. There was no statue, no monument, but in every cabin that stayed warm through a February freeze, in every seam that held firm against the spring rains, Ephraim's legacy lived in clay and moss, pressed by calloused hands into log walls from Georgia to Kentucky. Still, legacy is a thing most men only see in hindsight, and Ephraim had no patience for it. He was already working on the next problem. It started with a noise, an odd whistle that came through the Cade cabin on stormy nights, a thin sound like wind caught in a bottle. At first, he thought it was the shutters, or maybe the chimney throat, but after weeks of crawling along rafters and tapping every beam, he traced it to the corner join where the north wall met the east, one of the oldest parts of the original cabin, built before the first mix, back when he was still guessing his way through survival. There, hidden beneath a layer of clay and years of smoke-darkened moss, was a hollow, a fault in the corner notch. The logs had shrunk more than expected. The chinking had held, but the air had found a seam between the logs themselves, a hairline crack, no more than a sliver, but enough to pull warmth out with every gust. Ephraim didn't patch it. He tore out the entire corner. Neighbors thought he'd gone mad. Spring was planting season, and here was Cade, dismantling the corner of a perfectly good cabin, piling logs on the grass like it was October. But to Ephraim, the flaw was intolerable. His method didn't allow for good enough. That was the old way. That was how children froze. He rebuilt the corner using a technique he'd only seen once, years earlier, in a town deep in Cherokee territory. It was a triple saddle interlock, where 3 logs overlapped at each junction instead of 2, forming a tightly packed X pattern at every corner. He added fiberfill, boiled pine needles this time, and set them with hot sap before sealing the joints with his clay moss mix. When it was done, he waited. 2 months later, a storm came down the ridge like a freight train, snapping branches, peeling shingles, and driving rain sideways through the hollows. Afterward, Ephraim checked the corner. Dry, silent, airtight. That was when the whispers about him changed. Before, Ephraim was the man who'd found a solution. Now, people started to say he was building something no one else understood. Not just cabins, systems, structures that knew the land. Aaron Hensley began keeping detailed records of every building project they took on. He wrote down temperature readings, mapped frost lines, measured how long it took rooms to cool once a fire went out. He used a kettle of boiling water placed near a wall and watched how fast the steam dispersed, an experiment he called the fog test. What he found was remarkable. A cabin built with standard chinking dropped 15 degrees overnight after the fire died. One with Cade's mix lost only 4. That finding spread, and with it, so did demand. By late summer, strangers arrived on horseback from as far as Asheville and Oak Ridge, asking for guidance. Some brought money, others brought tools. One even brought his entire family, camping outside the Cade property for 3 days, just to study the longhouse seams. Ephraim grew cautious. He wasn't territorial, but he feared what always happens when something useful meets commerce, that it gets stolen, watered down, turned into profit without understanding. He remembered Clarence Milton's patent attempt. He remembered the forged papers, the court threats, the feeling that someone was trying to claim years of grief and sweat for themselves. So he changed tactics. Instead of handing out the method, he created apprenticeships. If a man wanted to learn, he had to stay. 3 weeks, minimum. He'd rise at dawn, gather clay, dry moss, split logs, stir sand into ash with his bare hands. By week 2, most left. The ones who stayed, stayed forever. That's how the Hollow Crew formed. 7 men, each from different towns, each with a different background. Blacksmiths, farmers, carpenters, even a former schoolteacher. They became Ephraim's inner circle, not in name or ceremony, but in work. Together, they refined the mix further. One man, Josiah Pike, found that crushed charcoal added to the clay darkened it, absorbing more heat from winter sun. Another, Ellis Monroe, suggested a layer of woven animal hair mats between logs before applying the mix. This created a second layer of insulation that held in heat even longer. But it was Louisa who made the final breakthrough. She noticed that the inner walls of the longhouse remained warmer than the outer walls, even after both were sealed with the same mix. Her idea? Density. The clay layers inside were packed thicker, not by design, but because women and children tended to lean on them, press against them, sleep near them. Weight seals better than pressure, she said. You don't just pack the clay, you press it with time. It sounded like nonsense at first, but they tried it. They packed one test wall the standard way, then pressed the same mix into another wall, and laid stone weights against it for 3 days before drying. When the fire went out, the pressed wall retained heat nearly twice as long. That became a new rule. After applying the mix, they braced it with logs, stones, even sacks of grain. Let it cure under weight. The difference was undeniable. And yet, for all the innovations, something began to change in Ephraim. He grew slower, not in mind, but in body. His right hand began to stiffen. Some days he couldn't grip the paddle. Other days he walked with a limp so deep it bent his whole frame forward. Louisa said it was age. Aaron suspected it was arthritis brought on by years of cold clay and hard labor. Ephraim never said, but he began delegating. The Hollow Crew took over more projects. They traveled together to distant towns, each carrying their own mix buckets, tools, and manuals copied from Ephraim's journals. They taught not just builders but teachers, pastors, even young boys eager to help rebuild schools and barns. Then in the fall of 1846 came the fire at Dyer's Ridge, a lightning strike on a dry night. An entire ridge community of 27 cabins wiped out in 6 hours. No one died, but everything was gone, and winter was 6 weeks away. Ephraim didn't hesitate. He sent the Hollow Crew, took 3 wagons loaded with clay, moss, tools, dried roots, and every manual they'd ever copied. He told Aaron, build it all, show them how to keep it warm. In 4 weeks, they raised 10 structures, simple but tight, each with double-sealed seams, each with 2-layered roots and moss insulation. Ephraim stayed behind, sitting more often now, writing by lantern light in a 4th notebook marked Emergencies. When the first snows fell and the cabins of Dyer's Ridge remained warm, one family wrote Ephraim a letter. In it, the mother, Ruth Wheeler, said, "We named the baby after you, Ephraim, born on clean straw beside a clay wall that didn't let the wind bite." That was the last letter he read. aloud. By spring, his condition worsened. His hands curled inward, joints locked. He no longer walked far, but his mind remained sharp. He spent his last months compiling everything, drawings, notes, measurements, into a single ledger. He called it the Warm House Book. He gave it to Louisa with one request: don't let them forget why. Not the clay, not the moss, not the ceiling or the pressing, or the heating of stones, but the why, the daughter buried in snow, the fear in Louisa's eyes, the cold that took everything until one man said no more. And in that why, the legacy would outlive him. Ephraim Cade died on a cool September morning in 1847, with his wife Louisa seated beside him, the ledger clutched in his lap and the fire low but steady in the hearth he had built with his own hands. There was no pain in his passing, just stillness, like the mountain itself had taken a breath and let it out slow. He had made it through one last summer, watched the moss dry on the racks behind the cabin one final time, and left behind something far heavier than sorrow, a standard. The Hollow crew buried him beneath the old hickory tree behind the longhouse, the same place he had first dug his test clay pits years earlier. They carved no elaborate headstone, just a flat slab of river stone, hand-chiseled, with 3 words: he sealed the cold. It wasn't meant to be poetic, it was just the truth. In the months that followed, the crew continued the work, not as missionaries, not with speeches or fanfare, but by doing exactly what Ephraim had taught them: traveling, building, showing, and leaving better behind than they found. Each man carried a leather-bound copy of the Warm House Book, now meticulously copied by Louisa, and bound by a tradesman from Brevard, who'd once had his own cabin collapse in a freeze before learning Cade's method. But there was something more powerful than printed words spreading now: memory. People told stories, some were true, others grew with the telling. In Tennessee, they said Cade's mix could keep a cabin warm with just coals. In Kentucky, a widow claimed it sealed out not only wind, but vermin. In Georgia, a preacher insisted he'd seen a Cade-chinked wall stay dry through a hurricane. Aaron Hensley tried to temper expectations, but he didn't fight the stories, because buried inside the exaggerations was the truth. It worked. In a world of hardship, death, and weather that took without apology, here was something that didn't require wealth or privilege, just hands, patience, and knowledge. And then, slowly, the knowledge began to shift again. By 1850, second-generation builders, young men who'd been boys when the Cade method first appeared, started adapting it. Some removed the clay layer entirely and used soaked bark sheets bound with braided grass. Others blended the mix with slaked lime to create a cement-like seal that hardened over days. A few even began incorporating brick into the interior, walls of log cabins, using Cade's layering techniques to insulate not just against cold, but also against summer heat. Some adaptations failed, others thrived. One particularly bold effort in northern Georgia saw a man named Solomon Greeley building a 2-room cabin with triple-sealed walls, 3 layers of logs with independent moss-packed chambers between each. It took him a year and a half, and he nearly died hauling the extra timber. But by all accounts, the cabin stayed within 10 degrees of temperate year-round, even without a constant fire. Meanwhile, in a growing number of settlements, especially in the more rugged hollows and ridgelines, Cade training circles began to appear. They weren't formal schools, just a few men and boys gathering on Saturdays to practice mixing, packing, sealing. Some brought eggshells, others brought ground bone. One man swore by adding honey to the mix, though no one could prove it helped. Louisa Cade, now in her 40s, was invited to many of these gatherings. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened like they were listening to a prophet. Her message was always the same: don't forget what it's for. She reminded them that Ephraim hadn't built warm walls to impress anyone. He'd done it because he lost a child to the cold, and he couldn't bear to let the same fate fall on another soul. Comfort wasn't luxury, it was resistance, against nature's cruelty, against the assumption that suffering was just part of life. At one such gathering, a boy no older than 10 asked her, was he proud? Louisa answered without thinking, no, he was tired. Proud men look for praise. He just wanted to sleep at night without listening for coughing. Her words stayed with the boy. Years later, he would become a builder of cabins, from the Carolinas to Arkansas, carrying a paddle stamped with the letters EC burned into the handle. But perhaps the most profound proof of Cade's legacy came not in clay or moss or logs, but in how others carried it forward without him. In 1852, a cabin fire broke out in a small West Virginia town. It was a dry year, high wind. Most expected the blaze to take half the settlement, but it stopped at a line of homes built in the Cade style. thick, chinking, fire-resistant moss, walls that didn't feed flame. Fire marshals said the construction slowed the spread by a full hour, enough time to form a bucket line, enough time to save the town. Newspapers picked it up. The Charleston Herald ran the headline, "Saved by Mud and Moss." Suddenly, the method wasn't just folklore, it was evidence. Engineers wrote about it, professors studied it. One even traveled from New England to collect samples from Cade Hollow, leaving with jars of soil, moss, and notes scribbled in shorthand. He called it a primitive insulation system with startling efficacy. But those who lived in Cade-built cabins didn't need science to tell them what they already knew. Their babies slept warm, their elders didn't wake coughing, and when the wind howled down from the peaks, it passed them by like a ghost denied its door. As the years passed, the method evolved again. Sawmills became common, cut lumber replaced round logs, towns grew, rail lines crept into the valleys. But even as architecture modernized, something remained in the way people sealed their homes. Layers, insulation, compression, natural material. These ideas, once seen as frontier superstition, had become doctrine. By the time of the Civil War, no one remembered a time before Cade's mix. It was like asking when people started using fire. The knowledge had bled so deep into the grain of mountain life that it could no longer be traced back to one man. But the mountain remembered. His cabin, Ephraim's original home, still stood into the 1880s, long after Louisa passed. It was used for storage, then for schooling, then left empty as newer homes sprang up nearby. But no one ever tore it down, not out of nostalgia, but because the seams still held. Rain rolled off it like oil on tin, cold never lingered long, birds nested under the eaves, and children would sneak inside to whisper stories by the hearth, tracing fingers along the hardened lines of clay, where their grandparents once slept in warmth. And somewhere in that structure, between the pressed moss, the dried clay, the powdered eggshells, the sweat and grief and fury of one man who refused to surrender to the cold, was a kind of defiance, a legacy not carved in stone, but pressed in mud. Not every man can change the world, but some men, given loss, given hardship, given nothing but raw hands and a need to make it better, build something that does. Ephraim Cade didn't see himself as a pioneer. He never called himself an inventor. He never claimed genius. But he learned. He listened. He refused to accept that suffering was the cost of survival. And in doing so, he rewrote how mountain people built their homes, not with just logs and fire, but with intention, with memory, with the knowledge that warmth is not a luxury, it's a birthright, earned through care, and that sometimes all it takes to protect that birthright is a little moss, a little mud, and the hands of a man who can no longer bear to watch another child sleep cold.